What would you do if your daughter walked out the door one winter evening and never came back? For 34 days, one mother fought against silence, knocking on doors, calling hospitals, begging strangers for answers. And then one January morning, her worst fear clawed its way into reality. A garbage worker notices something strange beside a small church on Spring Street, Buffalo. A plastic tote, half covered in snow. From its corner, strands of long blonde hair spill out. Frozen, tangled, almost glistening in the weak morning light. He hesitates, steps closer, lifts the lid, and what he sees will haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside, a young woman, naked, frozen, upside down. That woman was Amanda Wienckowski. For the police, it was an open-and-shut overdose. For her mother, it was murder. Tonight, on True Crime Final Chapter, we revisit the case that refuses to fade. A story of addiction, betrayal, unanswered questions, and one mother's relentless pursuit of justice. Viewers in this journey, we would unveil if the death of Amanda Wienckowski was an accident or murder. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon over the city. A young woman named Amanda Wienckowski stepped out into the night, unaware that her name would soon echo through every corner of her community. The wind that cut through the snow-filled streets that December carried the kind of silence that follows tragedy, a silence that would linger long after she was gone. Amanda wasn't a headline when she was alive. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend with an open laugh that seemed to melt away the world around her. She had a knack for turning strangers into friends, for finding fragment of hope even when her own life seemed unsteady. To those who loved her, Amanda was light, bright, erratic, sometimes fragile, but always warm. Born and raised in Western New York, she was the kind of girl who filled a room with conversation. Growing up, she dreamed in color, of traveling, of building a life bigger than the block she walked every day. But like too many small-town stories, hers became tangled in choices that blurred the line between freedom and danger. In her late teens, Amanda began to drift. The world outside home was alluring. New faces, loud music, the pull of independence. But with that came vulnerability, the kind that preys on trust and good hearts. At 20, Amanda was navigating a world that promised excitement but often delivered pain. She struggled with addiction, as so many do when life feels too heavy and escape seems easier than endurance. Her mother, Leslie, tried desperately to keep her close. There were phone calls late at night, promises of recovery, moments of relapse, and quiet prayers whispered into the darkness. Every step forward felt fragile. Every step back felt like a slide into a void no parent could watch without fear. Yet Amanda was fighting, trying to rebuild, trying to believe that her life wasn't defined by her mistakes. By 2008, she was on the edge of something new. She had plans to return to school, to make things right. Friends recalled her optimism, her faith that she could find her footing again. But just as the pieces seemed ready to fall into place, fate intervened in the cruelest way. It was December 5th, 2008. Snow drifted lazily under yellow streetlights. Amanda had been staying with acquaintances near Buffalo's east side, a neighborhood known for its rough edges, where boarded-up houses sat beside flickering neon signs. That night, she was expected to meet someone, just a short visit before heading home. But she never made it back. For days, her family waited. Calls went unanswered. Friends hadn't seen her. Leslie's instinct screamed that something was wrong. Amanda was spontaneous, yes, but she always checked in. When she didn't, panic replaced patience. A missing person report was filed, and flyers soon lined utility poles across Buffalo. A familiar face smiled from every lamppost. Bright blue eyes, long hair, and that unforgettable grin. Volunteers gathered, searching alleyways, vacant lots, and stretches of Niagara River. The police followed leads, some solid, others vague. The first days of a missing person investigation are often the most critical. For Amanda, they passed with quiet dread and little progress. Then came the news no one wanted to hear. January 9th, 2009. 5 weeks after Amanda vanished, a call came through to the Buffalo Police Department. A maintenance worker had discovered something unusual near a church on New Hurdle Avenue, an overturned trash bin frozen to the ground, sealed in ice. When they pried it open, what they found inside would haunt everyone involved. The nude, frozen body of a young woman, positioned upside down like an object discarded and forgotten. Identification came quickly. It was Amanda. Her mother's scream reportedly echoed to the hallway of the family home when the officers delivered the news. The police scene was stark and cold. Snow flurries clung to the tape surrounding the bin as investigators worked in silence. To the media, it was shocking, grotesque, a story that demanded explanation. How had a 20-year-old woman ended up entombed in ice behind a church, less than 2 miles from where she was last seen? An autopsy followed. The Erie County Medical Examiner ruled her death accidental, caused by an opiate overdose, claiming she died elsewhere and her body was placed in the bin post-mortem. But the condition of her body raised immediate questions. Her hair had been cut off. Bruises and marks dotted her skin. To her mother, the explanation didn't fit. Leslie had one unshakable belief. Amanda had been murdered. From the moment the autopsy report was released, Leslie became more than a grieving parent. She became an advocate, an investigator, a relentless force for truth. She studied every page of the report, every photograph, every contradictory detail. The more she learned, the less sense the accidental overdose theory made. If Amanda had overdosed, why were there signs of compression on her neck? Why was her body placed in the garbage bin? Who moved her and why? The official narrative seemed to close the case quickly, perhaps too quickly. For law enforcement, Amanda's lifestyle at the time, her known struggles, may have made her an easy statistic. Another young woman lost to addiction, another name in a file marked closed. But Leslie refused closure without clarity. She petitioned for a second autopsy. Independent pathologists reviewed the evidence and raised concerns about possible asphyxiation. They noted inconsistencies, internal bleeding patterns, petechial hemorrhaging, signs that pointed toward suffocation rather than overdose. Still, authorities held firm. They stood by their original ruling. And so began a battle that would stretch over a decade, a mother against a system that seemed determined not to listen. The last person known to have seen Amanda alive was a man from Buffalo's east side, someone she reportedly went to visit the night she disappeared. He had a criminal record and a reputation that drew suspicion. When questioned, he insisted she left his residence alive. Investigators found no immediate evidence linking him to foul play. Without physical proof, no eyewitnesses, no DNA, no confession, the case stalled. But whispers persisted. People in the neighborhood spoke of strange activity near the house. There were rumors of violence, of women going there and not coming out right. Nothing concrete enough for prosecution, but enough to keep the story alive in community memory. Amanda's name became a rallying cry among those who believed the system had failed women like her, women caught between vulnerability and neglect. Each year after her death, on the date she disappeared and again on the date she was found, friends and family gathered. They brought candles, photos, handwritten notes. They spoke her name out loud so the city wouldn't forget. Leslie stood among them, her face illuminated by flickering flames, clutching a picture of Amanda at 18. Smiling, carefree, hopeful. The vigils weren't just memorials. They were protests in silence, demands for justice written in wax and smoke. The candles reflected off the frozen pavement, tiny stars against the darkness. By 2019, a decade had passed. Officially, Amanda's case remained an accidental death. Unofficially, it had become a symbol of lost trust, of systemic apathy, of a mother's impossible endurance. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and podcasters revisited her story, piecing together timelines and records, pointing out contradictions that still defy logic. How could an overdose victim end up placed upside down in a trash bin behind a church? Why was evidence of potential strangulation dismissed? Who cut her hair, and for what reason? Questions lingered, and each one chipped away at the credibility of the official conclusion. Amanda Wienckowski's story begins as a tragedy, but evolves into a haunting mystery, a mirror reflecting the failures of a system meant to protect its most vulnerable. She was a young woman searching for redemption, for peace, for a second chance. Instead, she became a symbol of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. And for her mother, The fight continues, not just for justice, but for the truth that refuses to stay buried. The discovery of Amanda Wienckowski's body in January 2009 sent a wave of disbelief through Buffalo's East Side. Police officers, crime scene investigators, and members of the coroner's office gathered quietly in the icy morning air. The blue garbage tote sat wedged beside the church's brick wall, dusted with frost, its contents frozen solid. What lay inside was more than a body. It was a question that would haunt a city for years. From the first moment investigators arrived, the case already carried contradictions. The location of the tote, directly across the street from the home of the man Amanda was last seen visiting, should have pointed to an obvious suspect. Yet, what followed was a chain of decisions that would blur the truth rather than reveal it. Amanda's body was transported to the Erie County Medical Examiner's office. There, Dr. Diane Verts and her team began what should have been a routine autopsy. But the condition of the body complicated everything. Amanda was frozen stiff, her limbs locked in unnatural angles. She had been exposed to freezing temperatures for weeks, and her body was still encased in layers of ice when first examined. The team decided to let her thaw overnight, delaying the autopsy until the next morning. The following day, investigators gathered around the examination table. The details recorded in the autopsy report would later become the center of the storm. Visible bruising around Amanda's neck, consistent with the imprint of fingers, swelling and discoloration along her jawline, and abrasion suggesting a struggle. Yet, despite these signs, the final ruling would not match what the evidence seemed to show. The official cause of death, released in early February 2009, was acute opiate intoxication. In other words, an accidental overdose. It was a finding that stunned everyone who had followed the case, even members within the police department. The same report was signed not by one, but four medical examiners, an act that insiders would later describe as nearly unprecedented. To Amanda's mother, Leslie Brill Messaroli, the decision felt like a betrayal of science, of justice, and of her daughter's humanity. Investigators did not dispute the ruling publicly. In cases deemed accidental, homicide detectives were often instructed to step back. The ruling effectively froze the case in procedural limbo. Without a homicide designation, Buffalo police could not proceed with further criminal investigation. No suspect could be charged. No arrest could be made. Meanwhile, the primary individuals connected to Amanda's last known movements began to drift out of public focus. Adam Patterson, the man who had driven her to the house that night, maintained that he had simply dropped her off for a quick visit. He told investigators she left her purse in his car because she planned to return in minutes. He also reported receiving 2 text messages from Amanda after she entered the house, messages that said she needed more time. But phone records and later testimony would raise doubts about the timing of those texts. Some investigators quietly questioned whether Patterson had fabricated the messages to distance himself from what happened after Amanda entered that house. Inside 157, Spring Street lived Antoine Garner, a man with a violent criminal record. He had previously been charged with multiple counts of assault and later convicted for raping and strangling another woman. Neighbors knew him as volatile and unpredictable. When police first knocked on his door during the search for Amanda, he denied knowing her. It wasn't until they asked the second time that he allowed them inside. They searched his house, but found nothing linking him to her disappearance. But what they didn't find that night would later prove critical. A neighbor, living next door at 159 Spring Street, reported that her garbage tote had gone missing around the same time Amanda vanished. That same tote, blue with a black lid and silver handle, marked at the address 159 Spring Street, was the very one that would later be discovered holding Amanda's body across the street. In the weeks following Amanda's disappearance, police circulated a bolo. Be on the lookout for the missing tote and Amanda herself. Flyers went up across Buffalo. Her mother, Leslie, handed out copies on street corners and called news stations for help. The city's cold wind cut through her coat as she spoke into cameras, pleading for her daughter's safe return. Few could have imagined that Amanda's body had been just yards away the entire time, hidden in plain sight. When the autopsy results were released, the case that had once seemed clear began to fracture. Officially, Amanda's death was ruled accidental. Unofficially, Whispers spread through law enforcement circles that something didn't add up. Toxicology results showed the presence of opiates in Amanda's blood, but not the metabolite that would confirm heroin ingestion. Experts would later point out that the missing metabolite meant she hadn't injected heroin recently enough to cause an overdose. It was an impossible contradiction, the presence of drugs without the process that would have caused them to kill her. Amanda's bruises also told a story of their own. Finger-shaped marks around her neck, as though someone had applied force. Yet, the autopsy summary described them as post-mortem artifacts, a term used when discoloration occurs after death. To Leslie, the phrasing felt like an attempt to erase what her eyes could clearly see in the photographs. The more she read the report, the more determined she became. Leslie began requesting second opinions from forensic experts outside Erie County. Some declined, wary of challenging a fellow medical examiner. But eventually, 2 independent pathologists agreed to review the materials. Their findings were starkly different. Both concluded Amanda had died from strangulation. One of them noted that the pattern of bruising, the hemorrhaging beneath the skin, and a lack of heroin metabolite all supported a homicide ruling. The other pointed to signs of asphyxia, consistent with manual strangulation. The evidence, they argued, had been there from the beginning. It had simply been ignored. By 2010, Leslie's private investigation had become a crusade. She filed petitions, appeared on local news, and demanded that the district attorney reopen the case. Each time, the answer was the same. The medical examiner's report stood, and therefore the case was closed. No homicide, no prosecution. Behind the scenes, however, not everyone in law enforcement agreed. Internal emails later surfaced, showing that certain detectives within the Buffalo Police Department were still quietly reviewing the case in their personal time. They, too, saw what Leslie saw, a chain of inconsistencies and evidence that pointed toward foul play. But without official authorization, their hands were tied. The deeper the family pushed, the more resistance they met. When Leslie sought to have Amanda's body exhumed for a second autopsy, county officials tried to block the request. They argued that it was unnecessary and would disturb the integrity of the findings. But persistence won out, and Amanda's remains were eventually re-examined by an independent medical examiner. The second autopsy confirmed what her mother had believed all along. Amanda's death was not accidental. She had been strangled. Still, the ruling changed nothing legally. Erie County refused to amend the cause of death, and the district attorney, Frank Sedita, declined to reopen the case. The file was effectively sealed. For Leslie, the decision was devastating. Years had passed, and yet justice for her daughter remained trapped behind bureaucratic language and institutional caution. Accidental overdose had become a phrase that silenced further inquiry, transforming a violent death into a statistical entry. Meanwhile, the man most closely connected to Amanda's final hours, Antoine Garner, would later be convicted of raping and strangling another woman. He is now serving an 18-year sentence. The parallels between that crime and Amanda's death reignited public outrage. How could a man known for strangulation offenses be dismissed as irrelevant in a case where the victim bore signs of strangulation? For many, it was a question that underscored everything wrong with how Amanda's case had been handled. As years passed, Leslie's pursuit of justice grew into something larger than her daughter's story. She began advocating for other families whose cases were similarly dismissed by flawed medical findings or incomplete investigations. She transformed grief into advocacy, demanding reform in how suspicious deaths were classified and reviewed. Still, every January, when the air turned sharp and the streets of Buffalo froze over, Leslie returned to the place where Amanda was found. She lit candles in remembrance, their flames trembling against the cold wind. In the silence, she stood facing the church wall, the same corner that had once concealed her daughter. What remained was more than a mother's mourning. It was a city's unresolved question. Amanda Wienckowski's story was no longer just a case file. It had become a symbol of systemic failure, of what happens when institutions protect themselves instead of the truth. The unanswered questions, the altered reports, and the quiet persistence of a mother's voice became the driving force behind a growing call for justice. When the autopsy results were released to the public, The words accidental opiate intoxication echoed through Buffalo's east side like a cruel joke. For a mother who had just buried her 20-year-old daughter, it wasn't just a classification. It was an erasure. Leslie Brill Messeroli refused to believe that the bruises on Amanda's neck, the condition of her body, and the circumstances of her disappearance could somehow amount to an accident. She had seen the photos herself. She had read the report line by line. And she knew that her daughter did not climb into a garbage tote and freeze to death on her own. In the weeks following Amanda's funeral, Leslie transformed her grief into motion. While others mourned in silence, she began collecting documents, contacting journalists, and reaching out to forensic experts. She built binders full of reports, autopsy photos, and police memos. Every page told a story that contradicted the one written in the official record. Buffalo, in those days, was a city hardened by cold and resignation. But the story of a young woman found frozen and discarded in the garbage bin stirred something deeper: outrage, disbelief, and fear. True crime enthusiasts, local reporters, and amateur investigators began digging into Amanda's case online. Soon, her story spread through online forums and social media, sparking debates about police accountability and the failures of the medical examiner's office. Still, the official position did not budge. The Erie County District Attorney's Office reiterated the same conclusion: accidental overdose. No foul play. Case closed. For Leslie, those words became a wall she couldn't climb, yet refused to walk away from. She began appearing on local radio and news broadcasts, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with conviction. She described Amanda's final days, her addiction struggles, and her desire to turn her life around. She shared photos of Amanda's smile, the kind that still looked hopeful despite the chaos that had swallowed her. Every appearance carried the same message: my daughter was murdered, and I will not let her be forgotten. But justice, as Leslie soon learned, is not just about evidence. It's about power. And in Erie County, that power was concentrated in a few offices that had already made up their minds. When the independent autopsy reports came in, both concluding that Amanda had died from strangulation, Leslie thought the tide might finally turn. The findings were clear: the bruising around the neck, the hemorrhaging beneath the skin, the position of the body, all consistent with homicide. Yet, even armed with new evidence, she met silence. County officials refused to change the cause of death. The district attorney declined to reopen the case. And when Leslie requested an inquest, she was told it wasn't in the public's best interest. For a mother, it was infuriating. For an investigator, it was baffling. To understand how such a decision could stand, you had to understand the system itself. In Buffalo at that time, the unwritten policy within the police department was simple. They did not pursue cases they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Without a homicide ruling, there could be no investigation. And without an investigation, there could be no charges. The cycle fed itself, a bureaucratic loop that suffocated the very pursuit of justice it was meant to uphold. But Leslie refused to let her daughter become another statistic. She filed Freedom of Information requests. She appealed to the New York State Attorney General's office. She contacted organizations that specialized in wrongful death classifications. Each step was a battle, not against one person, but against a culture of institutional indifference. Meanwhile, others were beginning to speak out. Retired detectives, journalists, and forensic consultants reviewed the case and came to the same chilling conclusion: Amanda's death was anything but accidental. Her body placement, the missing metabolite in her toxicology results, and the absence of environmental evidence in the tote all pointed to deliberate concealment. How can an overdose victim end up stripped naked, folded into a garbage bin, and hidden for 5 weeks? Who had the time, strength, and motive to move her body? And why was that question never officially asked? The deeper Leslie dug, the more inconsistencies she found. Police interviews revealed gaps in timelines. Cell phone records didn't match the version of events Adam Patterson had given. The man she trusted to drive Amanda that night, the same man who held her purse and claimed he waited outside, had changed his statements multiple times. Yet, he was never charged, never polygraphed, never publicly named as a suspect. And then there was Antoine Garner, By the time Leslie obtained his criminal record, Antoine was already serving time for raping and strangling another woman, a crime eerily similar to what many believed had happened to Amanda. He lived across the street from where her body was found. His neighbor's garbage tote had gone missing on the night Amanda disappeared. His DNA had been linked to past violent offenses. But none of it mattered in the eyes of the system. The autopsy's ruling, accidental opiate intoxication, overpowered every other piece of evidence. To law enforcement, it was a closed file. To Leslie, it was a cover-up. In 2010, she took her fight public once again. This time, with help from advocates and private investigators, she launched a campaign calling for transparency in medical examiner practices. They organized rallies, collected petitions, and demanded oversight. Her persistence turned her into a reluctant activist, a mother who never set out to challenge the system but found herself doing exactly that. Local media began to take renewed interest. Documentaries, podcasts, and crime blogs revisited the case, re-examining the evidence that had been overlooked. Viewers were drawn not only to the tragedy of Amanda's story, but to the staggering indifference that followed it. Amanda's name became a rallying cry for reform. Her story was no longer just about one young woman. It was about every case where justice was denied by flawed bureaucracy. Years later, Leslie would finally manage to have Amanda's body exhumed. The process was painful and controversial, but she believed it was necessary. The independent autopsy confirmed her long-held suspicion. Her daughter had been strangled, but even then, the official record did not change. Erie County refused to amend the original cause of death, and the district attorney's office declined to reopen the case. Still, small cracks began to appear in the wall of silence. Internal memos later leaked from within Buffalo Police Department revealed that several detectives had continued to investigate Amanda's case on their own time, quietly, without departmental approval. They had seen what she saw, but their efforts were constrained by official policy. For Leslie, those hidden acts of solidarity meant everything. It proved that she wasn't imagining the corruption. It was real, and others knew it too. In the years that followed, she continued her campaign for justice, appearing at conferences, collaborating with legal reform groups, and keeping Amanda's story alive online. Each anniversary of Amanda's death brought another vigil, a gathering of candles and photos near the same church where her body had been found. Leslie always stood at the front, sometimes in silence, sometimes speaking softly to the small crowd that braved the cold. The scene became a haunting annual ritual. The flicker of candlelight reflecting off snow, the faint hum of passing traffic, the air filled with the sound of mother refusing to give up. But beyond the vigils and petitions, a larger question lingered, one that still echoes through the case today. How many other deaths have been misclassified? How many other families have been told that their loved one accidentally died when the truth said otherwise? For Leslie Brill Messeroli, the answer is personal and the cost immeasurable. The case of Amanda Wienckowski did not simply fade. It was buried beneath procedure, paperwork, and politics. What began as a tragedy soon revealed itself as a mirror reflecting something far darker within the system meant to protect citizens, a hierarchy where the value of life could be reduced to circumstance, and justice could be decided not by truth, but by convenience. After the release of the autopsy report, the district attorney's office quickly distanced itself from further inquiry. The ruling of accidental overdose became both shield and excuse. It was final, immutable. To challenge, it would mean questioning the competence of the medical examiner's office, a move that could open the floodgates for other disputed cases. So, Amanda's death was quietly filed away, one folder among thousands. The signature of 4 medical examiners at the bottom of a report, an unusual move in itself, carried the weight of authority that no grieving parent could easily challenge. But Leslie Brill Messeroli wasn't any ordinary parent. In the months after Amanda's death, she learned how the system worked, and more importantly, how it protected itself. She spoke to former medical examiners and attorneys who explained the uncomfortable truth. Once a death is ruled accidental, changing it to homicide requires a political fight, not just a scientific one. Each official she approached, from the district attorney to state representatives, offered condolences but avoided commitment. They praised her strength but cited jurisdictional boundaries. They expressed sympathy, then sent her home with reassurances that never materialized. To Leslie, their words began to sound like echoes of the same phrase. It's easier to look away. By 2010, Amanda's case had evolved into something larger than a single mother's pursuit. It had become an indictment of how society treats women who live on the margins, women struggling with addiction, poverty, and exploitation. Too often, their disappearances don't make headlines. Their deaths are labeled inevitable, their humanity slowly erased. And in that erasure, silence becomes complicity. Buffalo's East Side, the last place Amanda was seen alive, was an area long neglected by the city's leadership. It was where police presence meant surveillance, not protection. It was where crimes against women were often dismissed as the byproduct of the lifestyle. And when Amanda's body was found, stripped and discarded, the whispers began almost immediately. She was an addict. She made bad choices. It was bound to happen. Leslie heard those words from strangers, and even from some of the officers she spoke with. But in every public appearance, she countered them with the same calm conviction. Amanda was more than her addiction. As she pieced together Amanda's final hours, Leslie realized how much had gone wrong in the days following her daughter's disappearance. Police had visited the house on Spring Street twice, but failed to secure it as a crime scene. They accepted Antoine Garner's word that Amanda wasn't there, even though evidence later placed her inside. They noted that a garbage tote was missing from the property, and then, weeks later, found Amanda's body in one that matched the description exactly. The irony was impossible to ignore. In most homicide investigations, such a sequence of events would have triggered immediate warrants, forensic sweeps, and interrogations. But not here, not in the case of a young woman battling addiction. Forensic experts reviewing the files years later pointed out another disturbing detail: the lack of heroin metabolites in Amanda's toxicology report. In simple terms, the drug was present, but the compound produced when heroin is metabolized by the body was not. That meant one of two things. Either the sample was contaminated, or the heroin had been introduced after death. Either scenario pointed away from accident, not toward it. But even with that evidence, the coroner's ruling stood unchallenged. The report, signed by multiple examiners, became unassailable, a document locked in the archives of Erie County's medical office. When Leslie petitioned for an inquest, she was told that overturning such a finding would undermine the credibility of the department. The implication was clear. Preserving institutional reputation mattered more than finding the truth. By 2013, an internal Buffalo Police Department email would surface, written at 9:09 a.m. on January 16th of that year. The message revealed a disturbing, unwritten rule within the department. Detectives were not to pursue cases they couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, if a case was difficult, politically sensitive, or lacked immediate prosecutorial certainty, it would be left to gather dust. And that was exactly what had happened to Amanda's. Some officers, moved by conscience, continued to look into her case unofficially. They collected tips and leads during their off hours, quietly forwarding information to Leslie. But within the department, there was a sense of resignation, a quiet understanding that some cases were meant to stay cold. The truth was, the system didn't fail Amanda by accident. It failed her by design. The overlap of bureaucracy, public perception, and flawed forensics created a perfect storm of inaction. Once the case had been publicly labeled an overdose, every subsequent decision was filtered through that assumption. The police saw it as a closed file. Prosecutors saw it as unwinnable. The coroner saw it as confirmation of her initial judgment. It was a circle of certainty built on uncertainty. Leslie's persistence began to irritate officials. Her emails went unanswered. Her calls were redirected. Requests for meetings were delayed, sometimes for months. At one point, a county spokesperson told her she was wasting her time. But what they underestimated was a mother's endurance, especially one who had already lost everything. Leslie began partnering with journalists and private investigators. Together, they dissected every element of the case: the timeline of Amanda's disappearance, the contradictory statements from Adam Patterson, the proximity of Antoine Garner, and the condition of the garbage tote. They discovered that Garner's history of sexual violence was known to police long before Amanda's death. And yet, He remained free at the time of her disappearance. Eventually, Garner would be convicted of raping and strangling another woman, a crime hauntingly similar to Amanda's suspected cause of death. For many, that conviction confirmed what Leslie had been saying all along. For the authorities, however, it was treated as coincidence. The frustration among Amanda's supporters turned to disbelief. How could a system ignore such parallels? How could a medical finding remain unchanged in the face of mounting evidence? The answer lay in a culture that valued finality over truth. Changing a cause of death, especially years after it's been certified, isn't just a clerical adjustment. It's an admission of failure. It means acknowledging that an investigation was mishandled, that evidence was missed or ignored or misinterpreted. And institutions, especially those that operate under public scrutiny, are rarely willing to make such concessions. By the mid-2010s, Amanda's name had become synonymous with systemic neglect. Her mother's advocacy drew attention to the inconsistencies in forensic classification across the state. How many other deaths labeled accidental or undetermined might have been misclassified? How many families were denied justice simply because the paperwork said otherwise? Slowly, support began to grow. Organizations focused on criminal justice reform began citing Amanda's case in discussions about oversight of medical examiner offices. Legal experts debated the ethical implications of state agencies refusing to revisit questionable findings. Even within Buffalo, whispers of change began to circulate. But for Leslie, every step forward came with a reminder of how far she still had to go. Each time she stood outside the church on Spring Street, the place where her daughter's frozen body was discovered, she was reminded that justice wasn't just delayed. It had been denied. The candles flickered in the cold wind, their flames bending but not breaking. Around her stood other mothers, sisters, and daughters who knew that pain, the pain of being told that a system built to protect them had instead written them off. And in that quiet, amid the glow of remembrance, Leslie realized something profound. Even if Amanda's killer was never named, her story could still expose the cracks that let him slip through. What began as a mother's grief had evolved into a movement, a demand for accountability not just for Amanda, but for every victim dismissed by indifference. Subscribe to the channel so you never get to miss any true crime stories, because the next one is about to hit.